Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the studio to a LinkedIn Live with Ashley Bell. I'm Jacki Zehner. We're just going to give folks a minute or two to join live. Enjoy the music. This new song by Pharrell Williams called Joy, which is what I'm feeling today, having the opportunity to speak with Ashley Bell. So grateful that you are joining us live. This will also be recorded. So we're just going to take a minute or two. Just take a breath, get settled into your seat. Well, we'll wait for a few more people to join. And if you're digging the song, it is Joy Unspeakable by Pharrell Williams. We'll take a minute to join. If you want to move for a sec, you can do that too. I might just want to have a dance party after this. I don't know about you. If you're just joining, welcome. I'm Jacki Zehner with She Money. We're just giving everyone a minute because it's a live LinkedIn. And it'll also, if you're joining by the recording, we'll just get started in 15 seconds. All right. I think it's time to get going, though. That song was great. Thank you, Madison, for suggesting it. My name is Jacki Zehner. I'm the founder of She Money, and I have my She Money newsletter if you're not already subscribed. And I am so excited to be welcoming, I'll introduce him into the studio in a second, Ashley Bell. If you have not already read the article that we posted earlier in the month around the history of Black-owned banks and the racial wealth gap, and an interview with Ashley Bell, who you're going to meet shortly, encourage you to take a look at that article. It was such a privilege to write that article. I have learned so much, and I'm so excited about this interview today with the phenomenal Ashley Bell. But before I do, I just want to acknowledge that I am living where I am right now in my hometown of Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada, which is the home to many numerous First Nations here in Canada in the Okanagan region of BC. So I just want to acknowledge that. And with that, and I think, well, let me tell you about Ashley before I invite him on stage so he doesn't blush too much. Ashley Bell is, my gosh, you're going to hear how I met him, but is an incredibly accomplished lawyer, banker, former White House policy advisor of entrepreneurship and innovation. He worked with the SBA organization for many, many years. And his list of accolades and credentials is about as long as my two arms combined. He's an incredible human being. Also the CEO of Ready Life, which you're going to hear about, a new financial fintech company, and the incoming chairman of Redemption Bank, which will be, you'll hear about that too. It's a new bank that is doing an acquisition in my home state of Utah in the United States. So it is with great excitement. I'm going to have this conversation with Ashley Bell today, and welcome Ashley Bell to the studio.
Hey, Jacki, thank you so much for having me. Just really excited to be with you.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, as I've already said, it was such a joy for me to write this article featuring you, and maybe that's a great place to start. And I just want to say, feel free to post questions and comments in the chat. This is a live conversation. My team will do my best to feed it, their best to feed it to me during the conversation. But I had the honor of meeting you, Ashley, back in January when I attended an event in Salt Lake City where you were there with Dr. Bernice King to learn about, which we will talk about, Redemption Bank. But I'd love to start our time together, just if folks don't know you, a little bit more about where you grew up, a little bit about your background and your family history, which I've had the joy of reading about. But can you share a little bit just to get grounded? And who is Ashley Bell?
You know, again, Jacki, thank you. And for everybody watching this at home or watching the recorded version of this, really appreciate you leaning in and learning and listening. And hopefully this will help you understand that we all can take our ordinary decisions every day and make them extraordinary. So thank you for leaning in today. You know, for me, I'm from a small town, Gainesville, Georgia, which is about 52 miles northeast of Atlanta. It's a typical small town in the deep South, a town where my mother and father raised me. My mother was a choir director, a school teacher. Father was an engineer. Met at HBCU, Fort Valley, down to South Georgia. And I could say that I learned so much early on about my family's history, and I think that's a big part of why I'm here. Dr. King and I both, love to listen to both of our stories, and our families actually cross paths. Ironically, my mother was one of the valedictorian at Fort Valley State University.
Ashley, I'm so sorry. In my mother's office, and I did everything to make sure it was a safe environment, and I didn't do that.
No, it's totally fine. Totally fine. Totally fine.
Damn, I missed one. I'm so embarrassed. So please,
No, it's totally fine.
I'm mortified at the moment. Thank you.
It's
Sorry
totally,
about that.
it happens all the time. I've had
Oh my gosh, cold, hot sweat. Thank you I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, you're totally good. You're totally good. I was just talking about families crossing paths, and my mother spoke at her graduation at Fort Valley, and you don't think about things like that in like 1962. That her keynote speaker at her graduation was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And you think that it's such a big name that he is, that, back then he was a pastor that our families knew of, and he spoke at graduations, spoke at church events. And here we are 60 years later celebrating the I Have a Dream speech and all the things that came from that legacy. And what we're talking about today is a lot of the fruit from that particular tree. On my mom's side, we owned a black bank in our family. In 1934, we formed a black-owned bank in South Georgia, which was called the Bank of Byronville, that was built really for a very redemptive purpose, which was to take the lands that formerly had slaves on them, where those slaves, which were freed after the Civil War, sharecropped. And for those of you who aren't familiar with sharecropping, it is one step above slavery, but you really got to keep about 5 to 10% of what you grew to eat, to sustain your family, and to sell and trade for goods and services. So our bank was started to help those free new Americans and sharecroppers purchase the land from their former owners. And so my family and dozens of families in South Georgia were able to leverage that bank to purchase hundreds of thousands of acres for the purposes of creating wealth for our families. And that acquisition of the lands where we were formerly slaves allowed my mother to go to college, allowed 6, 7 kids to go to college, allowed me to be everything that you listed or talked about that I am, came from what can happen when you can take lands that were once used to the detriment of a people and turn them into something that can be redemptive. And I think that journey of capital, what capital means in a capitalist society, this unique journey of African Americans that have been the only people to ever be told that they have to go from being capital, meaning we were assets on someone's balance sheet, to having our own balance sheets. The journey from being capital to becoming capitalist is one that I think is embedded in my DNA and many African Americans in our country. And on this journey, we're trying to find solutions that can preserve our heritage, but also be hopeful about the future and what's possible in a world where we can have equal access to all the great things that America has to offer.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And again, I'm so embarrassed for that interruption, Ashley, for that incredible. And I want to acknowledge, in part of writing the article, and I'm Canadian, I grew up, and when you said family legacy and even fruit and trees, I'm sitting in the middle of an orchard, which is what I do in the summer. My father, who very sadly passed away last year, ran an orchard, and I'm going to be running after this to sell fruit roadside. And with his passing, I've connected so much to even our family story and our family economic and financial story, which, my mom grew up very, very poor, managing her family, managed a fruit stand, ironically enough. And here I'm doing that almost 60 years later. But just this connection to the land and sort of the history and what that can mean, especially financially, as you mentioned, with how you build wealth and writing about. And I think we both talked about this book that I'm just going to hold up now, which I recommend to everyone. And you're going to tell me a story about this book to your connection. It's called The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. And I know that's sort of probably part of the origin story behind Ready Life, but with sharecropping, it goes into the history of all of that. The end of slavery, even though the laws changed, didn't mean the economic reality or the rights and freedoms associated with those laws actually became reality, because they didn't. It was, as we know, many, many, many years later, and even today, that economic um, lack of economic access, the ability to grow wealth, to build wealth, as you mentioned, has something is still at the core of what's the current situation, right? So
Right.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that in terms of, and thank you for sharing that history, like, because I'm sure that really informed your career, right? And take us through a little bit of
Mhm.
how that history affected your choices professionally. And, of course, we've got a lot of years to cover in a short period of time. But, some of that early work, both, as a lawyer, and I know you were
Yeah.
have been an activist in so many areas. So talk a little bit about your pathway to where you are now.
Service has always been a big part of my family's narrative. My mother went on to become one of the few African American teachers, one of the first after integration in a school system, where she lived in that divide. She lived as a bridge between a black and white community in a town in the deep South where, um, you know, high schools were segregated, and as Dr. King said, the most segregated hour in the deep South was high noon on Sunday morning.
Mhm.
And we went to a church called St. Paul United Methodist, and 5 miles away was another church called St. Paul United Methodist. The only difference was the color of the people in the buildings.
Yeah.
And that is, that along with a lot of other things in the Deep South, you still, if you look closely enough, can find the fingerprints of Jim Crow in his hand on so many things. And though that hand may not be there physically, the fingerprints and the DNA, the maps that were laid out for a society that would perpetuate inequities is still there. And we have to be diligent about looking into that. And I think my family, tackle that from a different way of just trying to build bridges of love and understanding amongst people. My father was an engineer, and when NAFTA happened, he watched a booming textile market leave the country and had to start his life over. And it was critical for me to watch what he did, because he was my age that I am now, when he had to make a decision to take a job making 15% of what he was making as an engineer, because he didn't want to move our family from our town. Because a lot of people who are watching today, you got ties to the land. You're where you are now with your orchard and your family because you got ties there. You live in Salt Lake, but you're always going to go back because that the roots matter.
Mhm.
And in that instance, my father, I watched a man have to delete degrees off of his resume and interview with people that didn't look like him, that were half his age, to give him a chance. And he decided, you know what? I'm just going to do what I think is going to be most beneficial. He went and became a jailer at a juvenile jail because my
Wow.
father raised two black men and did an amazing job. And father and mother, but my father did an amazing job. And so he decided, you know what? There's a lot more black men out here that need fathers, and most of them are incarcerated. So he went and became a jailer. And that is when I had the inclination that all my other friends that were white had businesses that they were going to go join their father at and take their father's place at the family company. I decided I was going to go to law school and go be a public defender with my dad and
Mhm.
represent kids in neighborhoods that I grew up in and help tell their story and try to help give them a second chance. And I made me a better lawyer. Before I became a corporate lawyer at the biggest law firm in the world, I was a public defender in Atlanta. But my father moved himself up to warden, and I listened to his stories. I knew more about my clients than anybody, any other lawyer, because my dad took the time to listen. He took the time to understand how they ended up in the position that they're in. And it was always a system that didn't recognize their circumstances. And I tried to use the information he gave me, which was to take the time to listen,
Mhm.
take the time to understand where people come from and how they ended up where they are. And in that, it made me a better lawyer, made me a better advocate. And it cemented in me that no matter what I would do afterwards, I always had to carve out a time, not just for profit, but for purpose. And what I hope that we've done, that we talk about today, is this idea of doing good and doing well, to do good for people, for humanity, for our country, for our friends, for our families. And you can do well. Both things do not have to be separate. And I think that's part of the journey of the African American in our country, as to how do we go from being capital to becoming capitalists. We have great nonprofits, great programs that we do to support the undergird the necessities that are required for a just society. However, we're not truly going to be where we want to go until you recognize what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, my co-founder's father, is that you recognize the inseparable twins of racial and economic injustice.
Yes.
They cannot be separated. They are joined at the hip. So we can never truly have racial justice in our country until we're economically just as well.
Well, I mean, I just want to acknowledge that with an exclamation mark and then some. And I come from a lens of looking often with a gender lens, right, to look at sort of women's the inequities facing women historically, and
Mm,
um, with an intersectional lens, of course, but with the same, I think acknowledging that too. And that's honestly why I do the work I do in the world with She Money,
mhm,
which is around addressing sort of systemic inequities in terms of, women couldn't even get credit cards in their own name, as
mhm,
until a certain period of time not that long ago. And just understanding that, to your point, those two go hand in hand,
mhm,
uh, so often, right? And not so often, they just do go hand in hand. And with She Money, the mission, is as well to really focus on financial agency, certainly, but with that comes like what's systemic and what's personal, and how do those two come together. And I think, and this book was incredibly powerful for me in that context, is just setting that historical setting, which I think a lot of people don't understand, in terms of, what, why we, you have to acknowledge history and to change it. And I do think there's a lot of ignoring of history, or approaches that don't acknowledge it in the way that, because of this, American thing of rugged individualism, that we
mhm.
often overlook to put everything back on the individual. And capitalism does that too, rather than looking at systems. And
And I
I
think the
know,
book does that. I think the book that you held up,
yeah.
just one of the fundamental points that I think was brought up in Mercer's book was, um, it attacked this misnomer of the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's
Yes.
Bureau, you think of freedmen, which also was very specific to men at the time. There's only men could really make accounts there. But for those that don't know, the Freedmen's Bureau was the first bank created for freed men and women, but mostly men could only have accounts there. But it was created for men that were freed to be able to save their money after slavery. And there was a lot of education. This was the first iteration of financial literacy was teach them how to be capitalists, teach them how to be frugal, how to save. But the most important thing that and remind you, when we talk about systems, systems are what our government creates, what the private sector creates. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was created by Congress, signed by the president, was a bank created federally, the first bank created federally, but it was for the purpose of addressing the issue of the American Negro and how they would be integrated into a capitalist system. But specifically, this bank had one rule: you cannot lend them money, they can only save.
Yeah.
Now, you and I know in a capitalist society, without credit, you can't create wealth. And more importantly, if you look at the communities in our country today, when you look at that original sort of sin
Mhm.
institutionally, which will create a bank for them, but they can't loan them money, they can only save their money. But with that, if you look at communities today, you try to find the deserts of opportunity,
Yeah.
you'll see that those deserts of opportunity are lacking the resources that make communities flourish. And credit is that. Credit is like water. Where credit flows, things grow. Where credit does not flow, you do not see opportunity growing. But
Yeah.
when the spigot was never turned on from day one, then you saw those inequities multiply
Yeah.
quicker and faster and more in depth. And so you still today see what happens when you shut off that spigot, when you have a capitalist society and say these places water can't go. And then you wonder why that they're in the desert. You wonder why you have a thirsty people for opportunity when originally it was created that way. And I think every iteration of the Freedmen's Bureau from then till now, and we still, you can Google right now, discriminatory lending practices, and you'll see that we still have a Freedmen's Bureau type landscape today. And what I hope that people watching today understand is that if what you're hearing resonates with you, if you believe that we should live in a world where banking should be race agnostic, that people who live in these communities should have access to credit, and these are your values, that you
Mhm.
truly believe that, then I ask you to ask yourself, are you banking your values? Does the
Yes.
bank that holds your money, which side of history are they on? What has been their practices? And if they don't reflect your values, maybe looking at a woman or minority-owned bank would. And this is something that you can do that all of us have to bank every day. We can't exist in any of these circumstances without a bank. You're going to do it, but maybe this small decision about where you do it could have an extraordinary impact on someone else so you don't even know. And it begins with making that decision about whether or not your banking options match your values.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, Ashley. And it's I think that's a great transition into the story of Redemption Bank, and the history. I mean, obviously, you're talking about the Freeman's Bank, and again, I had reading this book, I learned so much about sort of, I wouldn't say the rise and fall, but the evolution of Black-owned financial institutions and the role that they play in communities. And to your point, and again, this is a message we talk about all the time, your money is an expression of your values.
Mm-hmm.
How you spend, give, invest, to the point borrow. Everything is it can be, if you choose it, to be a reflection of your values, and to align that is the power, we say, of the purse, but the power of capitalism in the good way, right, is the moral capitalism, and to acknowledge the power that you have with these kinds of decisions. So thank you for mentioning that. And I want to talk about Ready Life, but let's start, because you transitioned so beautifully into the story of Redemption Bank, which is how we met at the beginning of the year. So tell us a little bit about sort of how this came to be and your passion around it. Obviously, you're partnering with many incredible people, including Dr. King. So, and then it's going to be in Utah, which is, beyond exciting for me as someone who resides there. So share a little bit of that origin story and bring it forward to where you are now and why it matters so much to you.
It's been such a journey, and it's still going to be a journey. This is the first time in American history that a group of Black investors have ever purchased what you could call what African Americans would call a white-owned bank, and everybody else just calls a bank. But for us, it is clearly a distinguishing factor there, and this is important for a lot of reasons. But we felt, let me answer the first question about why Utah. When we look at the origin stories of most Black banks, and in 1936, when my family owned a bank, there were over 140 Black-owned banks in America, and today there's only 20. So just let that sink in for a second. You had 140 Black banks in 1936, and now you only have 20 in 2023. And why is that? And a lot of that is because every time, when you look at history from 36 to now, every time America has had an economic downturn, Black people, and then the other marginalized communities to a lesser extent, but in a pretty predictable order, are the first to get fired when an economic downturn happens, and then the last to get hired back when it recovers. So every time America has an economic downturn, these banks suffer the hardest. Yeah. A Black bank president can tell you right now what the economic conditions are for them to go out of business. They know the number that if Black unemployment hits in their community, that they're done. And that's what we've seen time and time again, is that these banks have a very highly concentrated, fragile ecosystem, and they have to walk a tightrope that says the way we score credit in this country says that people in these communities, you should have to charge them higher interest rates, making it expensive to be poor in America, expensive to be middle class in America. And at the same time, these are your people, so you don't do that. That's what makes Black banks unique, because they're the ones that are walking a tightrope when everybody else is payday lending and title loan lending, that they give folks an access to get capital, but doing it in a fair way, and knowing that they have to answer to these same people because their tithes from their church are coming in on Monday. They know that the nonprofits are holding their money there. They know that these are the people who are the buttress of their entire business. So they've always been doing the hardest work. And so now when we look at how do we create a bank that can be the next generation of Black bank, because the problem with that is that these banks can't grow quickly. They're very fragile, and they're always living on the edge. So Dr. King and I start really thinking through, maybe we got to rethink this whole thing. Maybe we try to just reconceive what a Black bank could be. And to be honest with you, the first thing that startles folks is like, I can't even picture in my head Black people owning a bank in a community where there's no Black people. It's just a counter.
I know, and I love that. I love that it's true in Utah.
Right. It makes everybody's heads like, I can't. But think about why you can't.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks twice about any other group of people owning any business in the Black community, ever. But that's a little bit of the prejudice we have baked in the cake.
Yes, it is.
Is that because we're like, oh, we can go into your community and own anything, but you cannot come in our community and own anything. that baked in prejudice is what we all have in us. And even for us, Dr. King and I had to think like, is this a good idea? But we had to think it has to be a good idea, because if this country is going to be what we all know it can be and live up to its true ideals, anybody should be able to take a good idea and go anywhere and be successful.
Yes.
And so
Well,
we challenge the notion.
and Ashley, just to be clear, there is so much excitement in Utah about this acquisition. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, there's surprise, but there's because you are challenging assumptions, and people are going, "That's interesting. Why Utah? Why what is an MDI? You know, how is this happening?" So I think the community, from my response, and I think people are going to be lining up to make deposits, including myself. But that's just to be clear, from my perspective, Utah is like, heck yes.
Utah has absolutely, well, I say it this way. This couldn't happen anywhere else but Utah, in my opinion.
Wow.
Now, that's a strong statement, but I'm being, to me, because I think that when you go to the places where the other MDIs have been, they pretty much have been baked in the cake and relegated to a very small part of the marketplace. Mm-hmm. There's a place where they think Black banks should exist. It is somewhere on the other side of some railroad tracks. It is behind MLK Boulevard, and that's where people try to make them stay. They haven't been able to break outside of that box to really grow. And you do see some make some headways. And now and then we celebrate that. But what we think is important is that you can go to a place like Utah, which actually has great regulations for banks and actually has great opportunity for technology.
Yes.
We want to use the technological advantages of being in a state like Utah and regulations like Utah to be able to reach every African American wherever they lay their head, whether you're in Milwaukee or Detroit or Miami or wherever you are. We want to be able to reach you. But on top of that, we also want to build a bank where our allies can bank as well.
Yes.
And to start from a position where 100% of your clients are not Black and go from there, we think gives us a different kind of foundation. When you have people that have been in a bank that has, doesn't have any delinquencies. See, think about this. When this acquisition is done, we will have the first and the only Black bank in America with no delinquencies. See, that has a ripple effect on how the regulators treat you, how fast you can grow, the type of risk you can take, the kind of thoughtfulness you can make about what you do with other aspects. But when you're already living on the edge, when you're a bank that's always a couple bad loans away from not existing, that's harder decisions to make. And so we think that this gives us a chance to really spread the field. But when we talk about redemption, it's for everybody who's been looking for a fair shot. When we saw COVID happen, and part of my role was to help create the payroll protection program and implement it. Probably the hardest time I've ever seen was African Americans not being able to get a call back from their banks when PPP first came out. And a lot of businesses didn't. But the reality was, unless you knew somebody that first round, privilege in this country was on high display when resources were tight, when people didn't know where to go. You saw the least, the last, and the actually left behind when PPP first came out. And that's where really Dr. King and I joined and said, we almost lost a generation of Black business owners, like lost them, because they didn't have access to banks that would work with them, that would help them. And we never wanted to see ourselves in that position again. After George Floyd, which was a historic in a lot of ways, right? Because you had the greatest economic downturn because we purposely shut down our economy to save lives, coupled with the greatest civil unrest since 1968.
Yeah.
When you put those two things together, and the plight of the African American was so besieged during that time. And so for us, we had to think, corporate America came out and said they're going to spend $50 billion for Black Lives Matter and to perpetuate, Black wealth creation. That's what was said. That's what was announced. And here we are, we're past announcement season. We're trying to see exactly how people spent that money and what they did. But Dr. King and I realized that if we're truly going to take advantage of this brief moment in the sun that is mentioned in The Color of Money, that happens every so often, moment in the sun where everybody wants to get on the same page, for that moment to last longer than a glimmer, we have to create institutions to perpetuate progress, to perpetuate justice, and protect that least, the last, and the left behind. And that's what redemption has to be.
Well, and thank you for that. I feel like everything you're saying is so quotable. I'm trying to focus and I want to take notes. I'm like, yay, it's recorded. I'm so excited to be able to come back to that. But it's so true. I mean, my background, Ashley, I think you know this, was at Goldman Sachs. That's where I had my career. And I understood very early the importance of, that obviously financial institutions can play. I never worked at, you could say it's a bank, but a big bank, but how ownership of those institutions matter and the practices and the values associated with those institutions matter. And, maybe this leads us, well, maybe let's talk about Ready Life first.
Yeah.
And because that's also just not to, and because I think the role of banks in our society is evolving a lot.
Yeah.
And maybe just before we leave that, because I've had the honor of speaking to you a little bit more about the vision for Redemption Bank. Obviously, you're saying it's national, it's not just local. Technology is allowing a bigger footprint with a limited, physical, virtual reach versus a physical location. Which I think obviously is true. And the fintech as a sector is exploding and creating greater access and greater opportunities to align values with product and companies. So before anything else, you just want to say about sort of even the vision for the banking system in terms of the role that banks can play. I'd love, because I know we've talked about your background with SBAs and, it's just that's a whole conversation, but I don't want to leave redemption without, and the conversation about the importance of banks and aligning your wealth with banks that are values driven. But anything else you want to say about that before we talk about Ready Life?
Well, I think that's a good bridge to Ready Life, honestly.
Yeah.
Because I think when you talk about technology, one of the biggest, booms, as you know, were fintechs. But the reality is that, we live in a gig economy where many African American small business owners, they make their money off of Cash App, Venmo, well, primarily Cash App. I got to give Cash App folks credit. They spend millions of dollars advertising and a lot of rap songs and a lot of culture stuff to kind of lean into the Black community. And if you're ever in a room, a mixed crowd, and you want to see how good the marketing is, ask people to raise their hand what they use. And I guarantee you, versus Cash App versus Venmo, you'll see more people of color raise their hand for Cash App because it's intentional. But here's the hard part, and why I think I really appreciate you giving us a chance to talk about Ready Life. But Dr. King is actually, we co-founded Ready Life together first, and then realized that redemption needed to happen next.
Yeah.
Because Ready Life has a key goal, and this is, I'll start at the top. We have to be honest with ourselves about the credit underwriting system in our country.
Yes.
We have to be very honest with ourselves. If we truly believe the three big credit bureaus, if we truly believe that algorithm, then we have to ask different questions, because that algorithm tells us, those 3 digits tells us that 54% of African Americans shouldn't be trusted with owning a home.
Yeah.
Any data, any number that can say that the majority of an entire race of people shouldn't be given the dignity, who work, who have money in their pockets and they spend every day, shouldn't be allowed to own a home. And then at the same time tell them that they have to pay more to rent where they live than people pay to own where they live.
Yeah.
Is anything short than oppressive.
Yes.
And that system is what Ready Life is tackling at its core. And so what Ready Life is doing is creating a platform that you can download on Google or Android for people who rent. And there's 17.8 million people in this country that rent and pay more or can't afford to own a mortgage, but credit score, down payment is in the way. Half of those people are white, 20% are Black, 20% are Hispanic. This is across the board a problem with our entire system. But much like Dr. King advocated during the 60s, is that when you isolate African Americans and you try to create a way for them to have hope, you actually help everybody else out. When that last rung comes up, we all come up. And so we can fix this. And so what Ready Life is doing is creating an opportunity for people to get mortgages without necessarily having a credit score. And here's how we do it. We listen in and we partner with banks that are of good intention and goodwill. There's a law that was created in the 70s called the Community Reinvestment Act. For those that know about it, great. For those that don't, it was supposed to undo redlining.
Yeah.
It was supposed to undo, whether in our country, redlining just wasn't for Black people. You can go to the Midwest and you'll find Jewish communities where Jewish people were in redlining and they couldn't get access to loans. You could find indigenous people find the exact same problem. It was all over our country. Whoever you wanted to keep down, put them inside the red line. Don't
Well,
give
and explain what that people might not know what that is, Ashley.
so
So, yeah.
so redlining was the actual geographic outline of certain communities
Mhm.
where banks would not lend money.
Yep.
And got away with it legally, were okay with not lending money in these communities. And many times they were urban, they were black, they were brown, they were Jewish, and this went on into the 80s. So we're not talking about, way back when. This was going on for a long time. So the Community Reinvestment Act was created to say, all right, banks, you created this problem, and we're going to force you to invest and to let loans to create loans inside of these formerly red lines. And if you don't, you won't be able to buy another bank, you won't be able to merge, and some other things could happen to you. But the problem is CRA, what it's called, has actually in some instances been used and weaponized against communities of color. Because what's happened is some banks said, well, all right, so I have to loan in this community. Well, I'll go find people that don't look like the people in that community and give them a loan and gentrify it. So a lot of times you're seeing gentrification happen in a lot of these old communities, and these loans are being created in these formerly black and brown and urban communities. These banks are getting CRA credit for it sometimes. And that's not what this was created for. So Dr. King and I fundamentally believe that we have an opportunity to partner with banks to say, look, let us help you go into these communities and educate the people there on what it's like to own a home. And in exchange for that, let's just use practical, reality. Practical reality is if someone is making if someone is paying $3,000 a month in rent, then why wouldn't they pay $2,500 a month in a mortgage?
Yep.
And why should some three digits that is some multiple of their credit card debt, maybe they got sick and they had some healthcare bills from back in the day, maybe they got divorced, maybe they had a baby, all these things could have happened to them, but the whole time they paid their rent on time. The whole time they kept a roof over their head. So why not create a score that separates people's needs versus wants? Things they have to do: roof over your head, water coming out of the pipe, so you can make sure your kids get to school and they're in a safe place. That matters. Why don't we reward people for those things? And so Ready Pay is our app that you can download. And we basically, people use us as banking as a service. They direct deposit. We see how they spend and we underwrite them. We basically say, we're looking at the cash flow that you have coming in. And then we go to banks and say, all right, they may not have the credit score you need, but let us close that gap by explaining to you and telling their story. This is no different than where I was in my dad's jail when I was a young lawyer, trying to figure out how to tell the story that nobody else wanted to listen to. This is that same filling in the blanks, explaining to the judge. It's like explaining to the banks, here's what you don't know. Here's how hard she works to make sure her rent is paid. Here's what she gave up to make sure that there was a roof over her head and her kids could go to school that you do not see in that three digits. People are more than a credit score.
Yes.
And we're close enough to getting there. So this Ready Life is going to be as successful as we embrace it as a community, as it's one of those things where, Dr. King are out, we've been fortunate to find really great investors that have come in and said, look, we got to change the way this is going. The banks are starting to lean in. We actually just signed up our first big $150 billion bank that's leaning in. And for those that want to see our TV commercial, we may have an opportunity to do that, Jackie.
Yeah. I think we should show it. I'm excited. I think Maddie's there she is. She's on it. Here we go.
What if you could own a home just by paying your rent on time? And if you've previously fallen on hard times or made mistakes in the past, you could actually have a second chance at home ownership.
My father's words that economic injustice is the inseparable twin to racial injustice is so true about home ownership. Your race, class, or gender shouldn't be an obstacle to you owning a home.
We created Ready Life for the millions of people turned away by traditional lenders. Ready Life understands how we got here, a system that has produced unequal access for generations. But we've created a new system, a system built off the belief that you are more than a credit score. If you pay your rent on time every month, you deserve to own your home. A new life for you and your family begins with believing you deserve more. Are you ready?
Nice. Thank you, Maddie, for bringing that. And it's interesting, Ashley, because after I started writing this article, so I told you I'm in Canada, small town, Kelowna, which was the scene of these horrific global news fires, actually. And that gave me a whole line of thinking about homeownership in the past couple of weeks. But I go for coffee. My mom has a morning coffee group, and with Tim Hortons or A&W, they meet every morning. And almost I've asked every single, and these are different groups that my mom goes to, and I always tag along, and I love it. Almost in every case, the key to wealth creation, that the story that in almost every situation people say is, I bought my first home at this, right? And I just want to put an exclamation mark. I've done a lot of that on this talk behind this book and that story, because it's, questionable with inflating prices, certainly in certain regions and areas that have this, obviously multiple of current earnings relative to average home price. What's going to be true for this generation now in terms of trying to buy into their first home. That being said, home ownership is for most in anecdotal experience and our own family situation, the way to build wealth versus rental. So I just want to say how important it obviously is. And when you ask people's money story or wealth story, or how they're, especially this older generation, that had access, to an, generally speaking, asset building of home creation. I just want to, that is so important. So I just want to acknowledge that. And thank you for seeing that intervention. And you are not your credit score is also just such a powerful thing to say out loud, because the problems with that, we could go on and on about the problems with credit scores, which is
validate your point. There are studies that have shown us that, especially for women and people of color, that their credit score has been a significant source of anxiety, of mental health issues, shame, a system that is trying to define you. It is a shadow that you didn't ask for, that you cannot escape. But when we look at our credit scores and what they produced, unfortunately, the average age of the first-time African-American homeowner in America is 46.
Yeah.
And if you're 46 and you sign a 30-year mortgage, and that puts you at 76 before you pay it off, but unfortunately in America, the average Black person dies at 75. So this math doesn't add up for us. This system doesn't add up for us. We have to find another way of doing this. And that's what Dr. King and I really focus on. We've advocated for justice, but now we have to innovate for justice. We have to create new systems. We just can't perpetuate the old systems and try to tinker around the sides. So we're looking for allies. And to do that, we have multiple approach. One, our investors that are helping us get to this point, we have builders that are saying, look, Ashley, if I go into a market, you go into a market and it's too expensive, or you don't want to compete against investors dragging up the price of houses, we'll build for you, so your people can have market-based home ownership. There's so many ways to help us spread the word, but at the end of the day, it's going to come down to us deciding, what are our values? What are we advocating for? Where are we investing in the companies that reflect our values? Are we banking in the banks that reflect our values? Where we spend our time, our talent, and our treasure defines us. It'll define our time here. We will be judged. History. We'll look back and see post George Floyd what we did or didn't do, how we spent that time, treasure, and talent. But we have an opportunity, I think, with Ready Life and Redemption to do more for changing the arc of history and bending it a little bit further towards justice than we've had in a long time.
Well, I mean, again, yes. And, this innovate for justice and invest in justice, and to your point, we have to look at how wealth is created in this country. Of course, being able to have homeownership is one. The other area, Ashley, where it just feels natural for us to talk about it a little bit, is the broader context of access to capital. And I'm very proud personally. And, I have made it my mission to identify and invest in, especially in funds started by women of color that invest in people of color, because the statistics as well as I do. We've written about this extensively. Then less than 0.2% of venture capital dollars go to women of color, and they disproportionately are starting businesses. And, Tracy Gray of the 22 Fund, Gayla Jennings O'Byrne of the Walkstar Fund. We've had them on LinkedIn Live before. Excuse me, we can repost this. Tracy Gray in particular. And we know that the Fearless Fund is currently being sued for giving grants to small, even micro grants to women business owners because of this backlash by the American Alliance for Equal Rights, and conservative activists, and this backlash against affirmative action. And it makes me wild. I signed the petition. Access to capital, in a broader context is something, to your point, that we have to innovate. We have to invest in folks that have the vision to create products and services for the communities they live in and serve. And that's how every great founder story is. I saw a need, I saw a product or service, I wanted to create it. If they can't access capital to do so, we're going to be stuck in the same cycle. So I'd love some of your thoughts about this broader access to capital question. And I just want to invite anyone in the audience that's listening today, if you have questions as we round out towards the last 10 or 15 minutes of this call, please feel free to post. So just open question to you about this broader access to capital, Ashley.
Well, I would first by talking about the backlash. And I think in Mercer's book, The Color of Money, and many other books, they highlight this, even if you're looking at Michelle Alexander's, book as well. When you look at The New Jim Crow is the title of her book.
Yeah.
We always talk about America is really big about, over correcting and the backlash after major progress. When you look at the end of slavery, you had Reconstruction era, and you had Black senators, congressmen all throughout the Deep South. Immediately after the Civil War, you had more Black people in Congress than you do today, the year after the Civil War. Then Reconstruction happened, and when the federal troops left, the Klan came, and you saw a complete demolition of that progress, and mass murders and massive backlash. And so here we are after George Floyd, and you saw this $50 billion of people saying, hey, we're all in. We want to protect Black lives. But as a Black person in America, I can tell you, we knew that the moment George Floyd happened, that things probably would look like it was going to be better, but there was a ticking clock that we knew time would run out before America would get back to its normal order of business. And the normal order of business is what we're in the middle of now. We have to fight that with extraordinary will to go back and stop America from going right back to what it normally will do. And what we're seeing right now is a backlash against people of color all across the country from every level of our society. And the only way to stem that is for people of goodwill to not just sit back until they get fed up again. Stay vigilant, invest in these companies. And we talk about access to capital. Yes, you're right. These funds don't get access, but Black businesses also don't, and even women-owned businesses, don't get access to the private equity dollars.
Yeah.
Many times we're told, as Dr. King said, to lift yourself up by your bootstraps, but that's hard to say to a bootless man or woman.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about creating wealth in this country, we have to shift the educational mindset, especially for our entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, 95% of all Black businesses are solopreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to shift people's mindset from creating wealth through labor and doing it through capital. Robert Smith talks about this all the time. You just can't have a job and expect to be able to create wealth for your family. You have to create jobs. And that's what we have to lean into. You can't do that without access to capital. So private equity is the untapped resource that we have to figure out how to connect our businesses with more often. And I can tell you, somebody that has to raise money all day, every day, the first thing is attacking the stereotypes, the prejudices that come with being a Black-owned business that is funded by venture capital. The first thing I have to explain to people is, okay, this is not charity. Let's start there. Okay. So don't think because it's a brown-owned business or Black-owned business that is there just because we want to do good doesn't mean that we're here to not help you make money. Like those things can both happen. I can create value for my investors. I can create a company that can produce returns like anybody else. But at the same time, I'm going to also have values and a mission. And you can do good and do well. So if everybody listening today, even though you may get pitched by a Black or brown-owned business, changing the mindset and being able to see these businesses that maybe they come from disadvantaged communities where their business model is going to reflect their values, is going to reflect helping somebody, redeeming somebody. But that doesn't mean that in that redemptive effort that they cannot help you get a return. We start there. And if you can accept that, then you actually can help them and not just write them a check and say, hey, here's $100,000 to invest in, but let me get access, help you get access. Because Melanie Hobson said it best. women and minority-owned businesses, the biggest problem after access to capital is access to customers.
Yep.
You have access to markets that we all are prisms, are imprisoned by our own networks. And we live in a segregated society still where we won't know each other or really get to know each other unless we step outside of where we are. I had to go to Salt Lake City, Utah to meet you.
Yeah.
I had to step outside.
Go figure, right?
You know what I'm saying? I had to literally go to Salt Lake City, but but vice versa. People have to be willing to step outside of what they know. And so for the Black business owner, you can't tell them that they just have to go and get, their customers have to just be Black because they're a Black business owner. You can't tell me just because I have a Black bank in Utah that my only customers can be Black. That's really hard to do in Utah. So we have to think outside of this and know that Black people can lead businesses and minorities and women can lead businesses that everybody should be able to patronize. The reality is that Ready Life is going to help a lot of African Americans, but the reality is our numbers show us that the person most likely to benefit from having a credit score that doesn't get them access to own a home is really a white, divorced, middle-aged woman. Yeah. That is actually our market. It is somebody who's had a life crisis that had to start their life over and doesn't want to have to go through building their credit over the next 3 to 5 years to get back on their feet, but they have a job, access to cash. It's just that by helping out and focusing on that bottom rung, we all can get to the top faster.
Yeah, well, again, I just love this conversation so much, and I wanted to go on for days. But I'm just so excited because yes, Ashley, and having thinking about I wear a lot of hats. As I'm blessed to have a family foundation that we do philanthropic giving, and I'm invest directly in predominantly women entrepreneurs and a fund strategy. And it's an invitation for us all to see the financial resources that we have access to, whether, if it's investment capital. And look, it's a call out to high net worth individuals that do investing to check their assumptions. And to your point, there's an investment hat on that seeks positive return, and there's capital is a spectrum. As philanthropic capital, the return is a negative 100%. The investment capital on the other end, you hope it's plus whatever X. And there's a lot of space in between. An investment that's aligned with your values, your passions, and interests when you check your assumptions at the door. And well, you don't check them at the door. You unpack them and you evaluate them and you educate yourself. And I'm going to hold up this book again because you mentioned the other book, The New Jim Crow, we're going to put in the chat. But it is such an invitation. My life is an invitation to
and let me tell you how
evolve and grow. Yeah.
Let me tell you how important that book is. Before I started Ready Life, my top 3 investors that were not African American, when I talked to them about Ready Life and what it could become, I asked them before they even considered investing to read that book, because I needed them to understand my why. Yeah. And the why. What is their why and the role that they can play in changing this. I guarantee you by reading that book and others, it'll make you a better investor because you'll understand what you're actually investing in. And you can be a thought leader and a partner with your women and minority owned CEOs and founders to help them get access to a broader market that better than they do, communities that better than they do. You can be helpful in a more diverse way by learning how we all got here. And I think that's what's been the attack in this new era is on education. People don't want us to learn our history, and it's really our history. It's not Black history. Our grandfathers and grandmothers were all here at the same time, and we are going through this together. So educate yourself, make you a better investor, and make you a better partner for the founders.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And we share resources. I feel like my middle name should be resources, like, book lists and links. And I think they're going to post, there's actually, I'm just going to mention this, Ashley, we have a couple more minutes. So I'm taking this course. I'm not sure I mentioned it to you right now, called The Trauma of Money, I just did a class. It's 17-week. It's a certification program. Actually, the founder, Chantel Chapman, I'm going to write about her next month for September for She Money. And this course had a whole class on racial inequities and the history of colonization and much of the stuff we were talking about today. And what I didn't realize, there's a Netflix special on understanding racial inequities, which who knew that existed? We're going to post that in the chat. And again, this course has been so transformational for me to unpack so many of my own, again, assumptions about a lot of things, but also just understand what does financial trauma really look like. And it's both individual, systemic, historical, obviously. And there's new language that we can show up with that we're not around blame and shame, especially when it comes to money. There's, and especially credit scores and all of that. Your credit score is can be a source of embarrassment, when the fact is people just didn't know what mattered, didn't know the strategies for gaming a system, that, and who is that system serving? It's not serving our communities. It's just not. And so where there's so much more, resources. And if you want to, we can also post and gather any additional resources you want to share, Ashley. But just in our final couple minutes together, is there anything, just huge gratitude for you coming. Again, if people haven't read the article, we have Ready Life, Redemption coming. We're going to post all of that, and they can go back to the original article to learn more about you. But anything we didn't cover today, and or just closing thoughts from you before we end this amazing hour?
Just thank you, Jacki, for being in this space, and providing me and others an opportunity to reach your network. And as I mentioned to you, I've had, friends that I didn't know were your friends who reached out to me and said, I saw you're going to be on Jacki's show. It's just been an amazing experience to reconnect with people. And I hope that we understand that, this should be a continuing conversation. We have a lot of opportunity ahead of us. A lot of things will change. Something else is coming around the corner. Who knows what it is, but we can get through it together. Yeah. We can make sure that we take advantage of these opportunities together. And so please stay in touch. Whether you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or on any of my social medias, I'm always willing to find allies. And if I can be helpful to someone who is, at the brink and at an inflection point, if you see yourself at an inflection point where you see that the next level of your life needs to be more impactful, or you just want to do things a little differently and take an ordinary decision to make it extraordinary, you got friends, you got people who are willing to lean in and be helpful. And I'm happy to be part of your network and you part of mine.
Oh, Ashley, well, with that, I don't know. Thank you. I do follow you on Instagram, and you have a big following on Instagram. I'll just say that. I want to, follow you around. And check out, again, all the links are in the chat, and just your generosity of time, Ashley, and for the work that you're doing in the world. I'm lucky. I'm going to see a lot more of you because I hope you're going to be in Utah. So just that's an invitation. So thank you again for letting us write about your story, about Redemption Bank, about Ready Life. I just thank everyone who joined online today and will be watching, this. It'll live on, and always feel free, if you watch it after the fact, to post comments. And thanks for spending an hour with us, and best to you, Ashley. And I know we're going to stay in touch. So thanks for being with us today.
Thanks again. Take care, Jacki.
Take care.